Welcome to BCM Reviews. I'm your host, Brian, and today I'm joined by a recurring guest, Chen. How are you doing, man?
I'm good, man. How are you? I'm happy to be here.
I've been good. It's been a while since we did this. I think the last time we did an episode together, we were talking about James Gunn's
James Gunn?
plan. Yeah, James Gunn's plan for the DCU, DC Studios, all the movies they announced. Since then, me and you, we chatted about reviewing all the Superman movies, seeing as how we're getting a new Superman. Written and directed by James Gunn, and I said that it'd be great if we could revisit all the classic Superman movies and see how it relates to what we're going to be getting in July. So I always felt that it was something that would have been very neat, and given how we did in this channel, we reviewed the Batman movies and we're also Spider-Man with someone else. So it's gonna be really cool doing this. And before we get started on the review, we're going to be reviewing the two classic Christopher Reeve Superman films, which, from what I understand, Chen, you've never seen before, correct?
I've seen bits and bobs, just running on TV.
Mm-hmm.
When cable was still the main way to watch,
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think I'd ever seen the full things before. At least not the first one.
All right. So then, in that case, that's what we're going to be reviewing. We're going to start off with those films. We get to Superman Returns. Then from there, we get to Man of Steel. If you're wondering why we're not going to be doing Superman 3 or Superman 4, well, for one, from what I've been told, they're very horrendous. And quite frankly, they're kind of, I could say they're of no service to us, quite frankly. So we're kind of like, let's keep the momentum moving. So we're on crunch time and we gotta, get the trains moving and all that stuff.
Yeah, I don't think when people are talking about the new movie, they're going to be comparing it to the Superman 3 and 4.
Absolutely. So I'm going to start off with asking you two questions, A10. So for one, I think I've already asked you when you first saw the movie, and I'm going to ask you, what was your first exposure to Superman?
So Superman in general, it's kind of hard to tell. I think that my most distinct memory is probably just the original kind of Justice League cartoon. I think that's the main one that sticks to mind. I don't think I've had much exposure to him before that outside of like toys and the symbol and stuff, but really that's kind of where I really got familiar with the character, and that was my big intro.
Yeah, I have to say that it's the same for me. I remember when I was younger, I had always had a fascination with Superman. Like before you knew me as the Batman fan, I was actually into Superman before that. And I was like, of course, when you're a kid, you're seeing this guy with big, bright suit, cape,
big red underwear.
That I would tie like a towel around my neck and pretend that I'm Superman, and when my hair would grow long enough, I could try to get like my sister to do like an S curl or whatever, pretty much like that. And of course, my first exposure to Superman was like the old Christopher Reeve film, which I think my mom and my sisters are really into. Then it was the Justice League cartoon. Of course, as time went on, when you're looking at superheroes, you always want something that's a bit different, right? So if you want something that's more pulpy, more that goes into, I don't know, more darker aspects of the world of comic books, then Batman is your guy, right? If you want something that's more kids orientated, then Superman is your guy. Not Superman, Spider-Man is your guy, right? If you want something that's a bit more, has more group dynamic and talks about poignant things, then X-Men is your group. And especially I'm sure for my era, X-Men Evolution was the show. Do you remember X-Men Evolution? Yeah. So pretty much that. I'd kind of say that for me, Superman is kind of like the introductionary superhero that kind of got me into Batman, Spider-Man, and all of the other characters from Marvel, DC, and all the independent stuff.
Yeah.
So as we get into this movie, and we're going to talk about how it got started, all the pros and cons of both films, and we're also going to talk about the legacy of this film and how it also shaped the MCU and how it kind of helped Feige kind of build that from the ground up, how this film helped Feige build the biggest entertainment franchise. So we're going to get started with how the film got made. In the 70s, this film and its sequel was conceived by a father and son producing duo by the name of Ela and Alexander Salkind. So the Salkinds were a French producing duo. They had produced an adaptation of The Three Musketeers, and Ela, the son, approached his father with an idea for Superman, and they wanted to pitch it to Warner Brothers. Now, Warner Brothers would give the film rights to the character to the Salkinds, but would not finance the film or be involved in the making of the film. The only thing that they would do would just distribute it. Which, for at the time, when you think about it, comic book movies weren't really a thing. We've had, of course, certain movies, serials, things of that nature. We had Batman 66. We had the old Adam West movie, but that wasn't really anything. Not to say that it wasn't anything special, but it wasn't like a big budgeted blockbuster film.
It was very much a TV show tie-in.
So pretty much the whole movie was a gamble. And Warner Brothers were kind of like, we don't want to lose money on this project or things of that nature. But they were very adamant in saying that if you're going to be making a Superman film, we are very adamant that we want Superman represented in the best way possible, and we want him to basically be represented as a beacon of hope among the grit that was existing in the 70s, because, the 70s, you have the emergence of filmmakers like Martin Scorsese, Francis Ford Coppola. You had films like Taxi Driver, Clockwork Orange by Stanley Kubrick, The Godfather, so a lot of gritty movies that was coming around at the time. So what Warner Brothers, I think what they really wanted was just something that could really be as appealing and as kid-friendly to the general audience, similar to like Star Wars that came out, I believe, a year prior, I think. So what do you think of that, Etienne?
I mean, I think that tracks. I think that it was definitely different than a lot of what the big blockbusters were at the time, right? And this idea that Superman represents hope is kind of one that DC nowadays is really kind of harping on all the time, and Warner Brothers, I guess, by extent, even if kind of Zack Snyder kind of twisted that message a little bit in his movies. We'll get to that when we get to that. But yeah. No, that makes sense to me.
All right. So when they were given the green light by Warner Brothers, the Salkinds quickly got to work, and they got Gene Hackman as Lex Luthor and Marlon Brando as Jor-El. Now, of course, these were two of the biggest actors of that time because, Marlon Brando from the 50s to the 60s had been in a lot of big movies at the time. He was known for a very serious actor, but at the same time, he was very problematic. He managed to negotiate himself a deal to get a certain percentage of the box office gross. He really, from what I heard in behind the scenes, he didn't memorize his lines. He had people actually hold up cue cards while he was doing his scene. Krypton, pretty much. And he basically had actors, not actors, but he actually had a cue cards on baby Kal-El's napper. So a napper is basically what they call a diaper in the UK. At least I could be wrong.
He was throwing it in as much as he possibly could.
Pretty much. So he was just very much like, I'm just here for a check, pretty much. I don't care much about the character. I'm just here to get a check. And of course, Gene Hackman, who is, of course, a legend. Rest in peace. We think he passed away, a month or 2 months before. So rest in peace. We'll get to a bit more about his version of Lex. But, of course, as I said before, Gene Hackman's a great actor. And by getting Brando to be a part of the movie, they also got Mario Puzo. So Mario Puzo, he wrote the Godfather book and the movies alongside Francis Ford Coppola. And they also got Guy Hamilton, who directed 4 James Bond movies, 2 Sean Connerys, and 2 Roger Moore films. So what do you think of that?
Honestly, that makes sense when you mention it. Especially a lot of the Lex scenes kind of have a James Bond-ish vibe to them in presentation. So yeah, I'm not surprised.
All right. So the film was planned to be shot in Italy at a studio where they filmed the James Bond films, but they couldn't due to an arrest warrant out on Marlon Brando, who was top billing. So basically, because of that, Guy Hamilton dropped out. You want to know why?
Yes, please.
All right, so the reason why is because Brando did a film called Last Tango in Paris, and I'm sure you've heard about this, where in the movie, Brando assaulted an actress during that film and had a warrant out for the arrest, which, is bad and all that stuff, and,
yeah.
Brando's a piece of shit. Brando's a piece of shit for that. And yeah. And of course, they couldn't get rid of him because Brando was top billing. So they were like, okay, we're stuck with Brando. So let's basically see if we can find another director. Interesting enough, or notably enough, the Salkinds were interested in acquiring the talents of Steven Spielberg, but they were kind of reluctant because, Steven Spielberg isn't the Steven Spielberg that we know now, and they were reluctant because they had heard that Jaws was over budget and a lot of things going around, and basically someone from their team basically said, let's see what his little fish movie does before we hire him. So, as we all know, Jaws became
a little bit
impactful, pretty much, and basically changed cinema and Hollywood and basically kind of created the blockbuster that we know today, essentially. So let me ask you this. What do you think of a Steven Spielberg directed Superman movie?
I think that would have been pretty amazing. I would have loved to see that. I think that could be a very different movie, a very interesting one.
Not only that, but it also makes sense. Like, you have one of the greatest American filmmakers in Spielberg, and him tackling one of America's greatest heroes.
Yeah, and you get another collaboration between the two classics, of John Williams on the soundtrack with Spielberg again, which...
Absolutely.
It doesn't get much more iconic than that.
The Salkinds, they settle on Richard Donner, hot off the success of his film called The Omen. Richard Donner, who was a fan of Superman, jumped on board and wanted to approach the film very differently, and brought on screenwriter Tom Mankiewicz, who also worked on the Bond films. Basically, from what I understand, Puzo wrote a draft of the script, which was very campy, very silly, and you see some of those undertones still present in that movie. And pretty much, I think that, from what I understand, Tom's idea, the screenwriter Tom, his idea for the film was that he wanted Kryptons to have like noble houses, like the House of El, and that they would wear the symbols on their chests. So a lot of that was kind of like a mainstay within, Superman, his lore, all that stuff.
That's something that stuck around for sure.
Pretty much. And they also were like, this is a Superman film, we want to make it as grand and as epic as possible. And Richard Donner's mandate, and this was the very important key to the film, was verisimilitude. So verisimilitude is Latin for something appearing to be true or real. And he shared that with all the departments working on the film in order to make the fantastical world of Superman, to basically make it believable, pretty much. So if you're going to take Krypton, or a guy that can fly, or someone who's stronger than a locomotive and all that stuff, you needed to create a sense of reality that could engage with the audience, pretty much. And you kind of see that philosophy in a lot of our superhero films, pretty much. Yeah. So what do you think of that?
The world is, the more the extraordinary kind of pops out.
Yeah, so what do you think of that?
I think that was pretty successful, honestly, for the most part. I think that, there's a little bit of like some early camp in the movie, but I think that for the a lot of the appearances of Superman feel very kind of restrained, and obviously some of it is for budget reasons, but I think what he does kind of use his powers to like their full extent, especially at the end of the first movie, it really kind of has a big impact. And so, yeah, I think he was pretty successful.
So let's talk about castings. The producers wanted like a very popular actor to play Superman. I had heard that they offered the role to Paul Newman for Superman, or Lex Luthor, but he turned it down. James Caan, who, for those who don't know, he played Sonny in The Godfather, the hothead son of Vito, and he just, for some reason, he just didn't want to do it. He didn't find it appealing. So basically, they had a long list of actors for the role of Superman, and they had at least, maybe 300 people, or maybe even more, or something like that. So basically, I think the casting director settled on Christopher Reeve. Christopher Reeve, who was at the bottom of the list, and even the casting director had to really vouch for him because, he basically felt that he had a very earnest look about him, and also there's something very interesting how, based off this casting, this has kind of followed the trend of Superman that we've gotten since then. That a lot of the Supermans we've gotten are unknown actors. Either they've done theater or things like that. A little bit more on Christopher Reeve. He is a Juilliard trained actor who was friends with people like Robin Williams, and I think even roommates with Kevin Conroy, who voiced Batman, rest in peace. And based off the little screen test that he did, they were sold. They were sold immediately, sold on his ability to kind of control the room and really allow the suit to make allowed the suit to, do the work and everything. So pretty much all of that. And he basically crushed it, and we see that in the film. So what do you think of that, Etienne?
Yeah, I mean, I think his performance was kind of extraordinary and really defined the character. A lot of the other actors I think would have probably been fine, but I think that Christopher Reeves is so iconic for a reason, and I don't know that there could have been a better pick.
But there's also the unknown factor, because there's something about, I don't know, Superman is supposed to be, at least from what I understand, like the underdog, right? And there's something about it where he is, the less you know about him, the better.
Yeah,
and the fact that you've
missed.
Yeah, so the fact that the less you know about him kind of adds to the mystique of the character, and that has kind of really helped in a lot of the casting since then. And let me ask you this: who's more difficult to cast, Batman or Superman?
I think Superman.
I agree.
But I think that both also require very different kind of types of performance, right? Because Batman, you need an actor who's very physical, playing the part of Batman, like at least the Cape Crusader part and the Bruce Wayne part. I don't think that the Batman part itself is that difficult. Assuming you have the physical, it's just sounding kind of gruff and stoic. Mm-hmm. It's really kind of playing the Bruce Wayne part that's difficult, where you convey a person that kind of has that darkness inside. Versus Superman, you're playing two roles that are extremely different, and having to make that switch between them be believable. Especially in the way that Christopher Reeves does it is really, really hard, right? And I don't think that's something that Henry Cavill did. I think he was great as Superman, didn't have much of a Clark, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, so let's get into Margot Kidder. What are your thoughts on her? Because from what I understand, when she auditioned for the role of Lois Lane, Donner was kind of like, I don't know, she's a klutz, she's a bit of a screw up, but I think that due to Margot Kidder's neuroticism, it also added it onto the character of Lois. And there's kind of like this recurring gag, especially in the comics, from what I understand, is that, she's a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter, but she can't spell.
Yeah, I think that it's funny because, Lois in the comics that she's, shown a lot of times is overwhelmingly competent, right? Mm-hmm. Like, she's extremely smart, extremely competent. And I think it's kind of interesting to see kind of a different take in this movie. Which is obviously the one that most people are kind of familiar with now. But I thought that it really worked. I thought it was really a great take on the character and very lovable.
Yeah. Absolutely. So, of course, seeing as how they've gotten their Lois and Clark, and the production was kind of like, there was subtraction going on. So this required Christopher Reeve to train for the role of Superman, because at the time Christopher Reeve was just like, he was strength-being, he was very skinny, and he trained with David Prowse, who was the guy in the suit, in the Darth Vader suit in the old Star Wars films. So he trained with him and gained, I think he was 185 and went from 215, I think, or something to that effect. So basically he really put in like a lot of work to make sure that he got the physique right. And right. You can, and of course, that's a pattern that we see with a lot of Supermans, where, they have to train very physically, very rigorously in order to appear as the Man of Steel and also fill in, the suit as well. So let's talk about the movie. First, it's very highly produced, particularly for its time, and it has a very impactful opening where you have kids opening a comic book, and it kind of represents a sense of earnestness, where I think the kids basically say how in a turbulent time within Metropolis, the Daily Planet is seen as a beacon of truth and hope in very turbulent times, especially in the Great Depression. That's where that's when Superman was created. So what do you think about that, Etienne?
I think it was a kind of really important way to start the movie, especially given the historical context. The first mainstream comic book movie, it's one that's trying to take itself a little bit more seriously than the kind of campiness that was expected at the time, especially coming out of the 60s. It's a way to kind of set audience expectations while also showing like a genuine love for the character. So I thought it was a very effective way to kind of get into to start.
Yeah. Not only that, but it's also representative of a lot of the childlike innocence as well, because you have a child who's opening this comic book and is basically showing, how can you say, because this film came out at a time when this is post-Vietnam War America. This was the Richard Nixon scandal. So a lot of people weren't very certain of the institution that were meant to protect them and tell them the truth. So to kind of give them a bit of, how can you say, a bit of hopium, to kind of ease the burdens and the struggles of that time.
Yeah, and I
Was
also think
kind
it's
of
kind
bit
of
good.
yeah, agreed. I think it's kind of setting the audience expectations to a certain extent too, because it's saying, hey, like think back to your childhood when you were reading Superman and kind of putting you in that mindset.
Mm-hmm. So I'd also will say that another talking point is this is a very by the numbers Superman film in the sense that, this kind of introduces you to the origins, and since then we've kind of had a repeat of that with films like, this film, Man of Steel, Superman the animated series from the 90s, and a lot of that. So what do you think of the opening of how the film starts off in Krypton?
I think it's kind of interesting, especially like because we've seen a lot of different takes on it, from the different animated TV shows to all the different movies to just recently kind of in the comics with the absolute version, which I really, really love. I felt like Krypton, I would have liked to almost see more of it. I understand they're doing the kind of crystalline projection to make it more similar to, Kryptonite and the Fortress of Solitude. I thought that it kind of felt very bland. But I will also say that the way that they kind of do the council scene and starting with the interrogation of Zod and his minions kind of had a very not epic feel to it, but it had it felt kind of grand.
Yeah, me too. I really enjoyed the production. I think it really set the stage for what type of movie we were getting. And, something that I also found very interesting is how I remember there was like a discussion that was happening online how the film is great at that part of the movie where, we're introduced to like Krypton and everything. But when you get to Metropolis, that's where things start to get campy because there is more of a grounded, almost Shakespearean aspect of the story.
Yeah, they feel completely different.
Yeah, there's an almost tonal shift, and you basically can see where Richard Donner's input really affected the story pretty much. And of course, as we all know, Krypton is destroyed, and Superman is sent to Earth. Zod and his minions are trapped in the Phantom Zone, and the effects are very dated and very, very funny.
Did they actually call it the Phantom Zone, or they just put him in a mirror and kind of show?
No, that is the Phantom Zone. That is their version of the Phantom Zone, pretty much.
Yeah.
So we cut to, of course, the Kents, Martha and Jonathan, finding young baby Clark. Of course, we realize, okay, this isn't just some regular normal kid. This kid has powers and all of that. Which, a little side note there, the film is filmed, that part of the film, Smallville, is filmed in Alberta. So very interesting how an American film is made in Canada. Anyway.
It's almost like that happens very often.
It happens very often, especially here in Winnipeg. So pretty much, the story follows as traditional Superman stories do, him in Smallville. And, this kind of also led to the inspiration of the TV show Smallville, where we focused basically, Superman's story before he became Superman in Smallville. And then you have, of course, Clark realizing that he's not like the other kids. He has powers. He has to downplay himself. He can't participate in sports and all of that. And you also have the wise wisdom of Jonathan Kent basically telling him that, hey, you have more things to do than just to score touchdowns, and you have potential. And you have, of course, a scene where he dies from a heart attack and all of that. So what do you think of that?
Yeah, I thought it was interesting because at the time, right, the comic canon was that Ma and Pa Kent they're very much still alive, so that was kind of a change from the usual storyline. And I kind of wonder why he did that. I do think it works though. I think it's funny because we kind of see this more not spoiled, but very much like a child kind of or a more immature version of Clark, which is basically the same version that we see kind of start the story because there's not that much time that spans between the death and then his transition to Metropolis. But he kind of has like shows this mischievous side with like just running just to show up his bully a little bit. But he's not shown as malevolent either. He kind of has like we also see the beginnings of like pushover kind of Clark idea. Yeah, I thought it was very effective. I wish we'd had more time with the Kents in general before he just goes, okay, I'm leaving and I'll never see you again. Bye. But I thought it was done well. I thought it nice kind of set up some of the messages in the movie.
Yeah, and of course you also have, as it would pay off later, because Pa Kent dies, and this kind of creates a sense of conflict with Superman, where although he has all this great power, he couldn't save his dad, and it also sets up at least something that I have some trouble with, him turning back the Earth and turning back time, which I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of, but I understand it within the context of the story. So, of course, Clark decides to leave Smallville, and there's also this great shot of like him in the wheat field, and he realizing that, oh, okay, so if I'm going to find my purpose, I need to leave Kansas. And of course, the scene prior, he finds the green crystal and heads to the North Pole and finds the Fortress of Solitude. What do you think of that?
The Fortress of Solitude scene was kind of really cool.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's weird, and I don't want to delve too much into it because I have a lot of thoughts about the time travel and its thematic implications.
Mm-hmm.
But kind of just touching on it quickly, I don't think that the movie wanted to. I think that Superman having weakness outside of kryptonite wasn't necessarily something that they wanted to kind of show, right? They really wanted to be
Mm-hmm.
like he can do anything, like almost literally anything,
Mm-hmm.
and it's more about him struggling with the responsibility and the balance rather than actually being challenged in a physical way, I guess you could say.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so far so good.
So far, so good. So, of course, this is where the film kind of turns on its head, where now we are kind of introduced to Metropolis and the very lively and spunky Daily Planet, where we're introduced to Jimmy Olsen, Lois Lane, Perry White. We're seeing Clark Kent as the journalist reporter, and we are also seeing the excellent chemistry between the two, Christopher Reeve and
Yeah.
Margot Kidder. So, what do you think of that?
I love their chemistry. I think the very kind of mischievous energy of Clark really plays well with kind of her neuroticism, and you can kind of see his like really playing up the awkward aspect, but still trying to get in edgewise all the time, trying to like make her recognize his value and kind of overplaying the wimp sometimes. I thought it was really kind of a really fun dynamic, especially when you know that for him it's pretty much just an act, but there's also kind of that desire to be seen and appreciated.
Mm-hmm.
And especially seeing like how Perry kind of treats him with respect and everything. And I even like Jimmy in the movie. I know he doesn't have a huge part and he kind of just disappears later.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, no, I thought it was great. Honestly, the Daily Planet scenes are probably my favorites.
Yeah, I agree. I love the lively energy. I love I can say this is obviously, I forget when it came out, but All the President's Men. So this was the film that basically talked about the whole Nixon scandal. So basically, this kind of really showed what was going on around the time with like newspapers, print journalism, things of that nature. I really enjoyed that. I really loved the lively aspect that the Daily Planet has, the energy. Really, what could have been something that was very campy, it felt very serious and very palatable, like
Yeah,
something that you could believe what's going on.
it felt grounded and it was silly, but not like unbelievably silly. Like it was just like regular kind of workplace hijinks. Um,
Absolutely.
Yeah. No, it's very all of the Daily Planet scenes are very like wholesome and foundational to kind of how we see Superman, and especially how we see Clark
Absolutely.
and how they kind of reflect off each other.
Absolutely. Oh, forgot to mention, the actor who played young Clark Kent actually had to get like a full prosthetic nose and had his voice lines dubbed over by Christopher Reeve, which to me I just felt that was foul. You're a young actor and you're brought because of your uniqueness, but yet for some reason you're not being allowed to basically do your job, which is a little something that, I don't think that's cool, but, other than
Yeah,
that, based from.
he's not in it for that long, right? And the scenes he's
Mhm.
in, obviously he does kind of resemble Reeves a lot, and he does play the part. But how much of it is because of outside intervention, I couldn't tell you.
Yeah. So there's of course, as we talked about, there's the shift, and of course the VFX. What do you think of the VFX of the time, like the flying scenes, super strength, all of that? What do you think of that?
I thought they were pretty good. I thought they're not like on the level of anything nowadays, but I thought they were pretty convincing, despite their limitations. I thought yeah, overall, I think they're pretty great.
Yeah, me too. I do enjoy a lot of the flying scenes. I heard that they're basically testing out all types of ideas. They were thinking about shooting like a Superman mannequin from a cannon. They were thinking about using like an animatronic doll for the flying scenes, but that didn't work out.
Right. I thought that honestly, before Zod and the other Kryptonians show up, like all of the scenes where we kind of get to see his powers are done really well, right? Nothing is done obviously enough that it kind of takes me out. It's all kind of done in a very believable way, even despite the special effects not being up to the level they would be now. I think like everything about him looks really good.
Absolutely. And what do you think of Gene Hackman's as Lex Luthor? I remember when we were watching the movie, you had a lot of opinions and thoughts about it.
I do. Hey, okay. I have a lot of opinions on a lot of the scenes with Lex.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't have any issues with Gene Hackman's portrayal. I think he's awesome. I think he kind of has this narcissistic energy, super down, the kind of confidence, the kind of scummy side, but he fully knows that he's in the wrong, and kind of thrives in it. No, I thought Gene Hackman is incredible in this movie. He always like steals the show. He's always there, and he kind of has like almost like a harmless kind of energy to him, where he's just telling you exactly like what he's gonna do and how he feels, and he's like, I'm the greatest villain
of the 20th century.
Yeah, exactly. Only to actually, back it up a second later.
So what do you think of his gang, Otisburg and Eve Tessmacher?
Hated them. I did not like them whatsoever.
Well, it's we're gonna see them again in Superman, the James Gunn movie, or at least James Gunn's version of them. What do you think of that?
I have faith. Question mark. I didn't like him. I thought that having Otisburg kind of being like a dumb stooge, that I'm like, why does he keep him around? He can clearly hire somebody more competent. And
but you also think about it in the sense that Lex Luthor, in many versions, he's a megalomaniac. So he obviously wants people who are dumber than him to be around his circle so that they can reassert his genius.
Yeah. I think there could have been a better way. So, like, the thing that really gets me is, especially given like how horrible the things that Lex does in this movie are, and he kind of does, like, he has so much casual cruelty, and zero remorse. And when we see kind of some of the actions of Miss Tessmacher, nothing about her kind of reads as like she was somebody who'd be okay with this, right? She seems like she's a good person despite it all, and she's, she's with him for the money, and she may or may not actually like him, and some of it is just, like cloud chasing, but she doesn't seem like she's a bad person. And seeing that, like,
and saves Superman in the end.
Yeah, exactly. But seeing that she has no issue with this plan to like murder all of the West Coast just for better real estate, I was like, that's like really fucked up. Like, does nobody like present the fact that he's killing like millions of people? Nobody has an issue with that.
Not only that, but I also just found the setup a bit weird, I guess. But I don't know. I think that from what I'm trying to understand was that in the 70s, Lex Luthor wasn't the evil businessman. That came later in the 80s.
He was the guy who stole the pies.
Though what he would do would just be more of a classic villain who would do real estate schemes or steal things or be a mad scientist or whatever, which, of course, we like that about Lex Luthor, but I don't know. It just also felt weird, like Metropolis PD knows about Lex Luthor, and
they get outsmarted by like Otisburg, and I felt like
technically they get outsmarted by Lex because Lex threw them off Otisburg's trail, and of course we see Lex with hair yet again, which apparently Gene Hackman was very resistant to the idea of going bald. Apparently Richard Donner basically said, "Hey, listen, I will shave my mustache if you shave your." So basically, it was all done on bet, and only that, if you noticed in the movie, Lex Luthor wears different wigs to show that he's going bald as a recurring gag, pretty much.
Yeah, I just think it's interesting because this portrayal of the character is so charismatic, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I don't think he needed the minions when he could have gotten kind of anything he wanted by himself. And I wish we kind of delve into that more, because when we do eventually get to him with Zod and whatever, I think that he really shines as like, oh yeah, no, he's the real deal.
Yeah, I think I agree. He does shine as a villain in the second film. What do you think of John Williams' score? Now, I'll say this. As a kid, I always got confused between this score and the Star Wars theme.
Yeah, there's a lot of similarities for sure. But I mean, it's John Williams, man. It's so good.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that even for me, like, I don't remember much about seeing the movie, but whenever I heard the theme, it's always been Superman, right? And
Yeah.
just like subconsciously or from maybe seeing it on TV like around, like you hear it instantly. It's, oh no, this is Superman. Yeah, I think the soundtrack is extraordinary, and I think it adds a lot to the kind of, especially the scenes that are more serious and kind of dive more into the heroic side. And I'm sure we'll get to it, but especially that first scene where he goes around at night saving people, it's so good. Like by far the best scene in the whole, to me anyways, in the whole two movies. Like, and it's not even close.
Yeah, yeah. When Richard Donner met with John Williams, the idea was for the theme to sing. That whenever the idea was for that theme to really identify Superman. So when you hear da da da, you're screaming Superman at the same time, and a lot of the score was kind of really meant to represent that, and that it was very meant to really represent the character, the optimism, the truth, and all
Yeah.
that stuff.
Yeah.
So yeah,
And it
that was
certainly
pretty
does,
much
right?
it.
It has those notes of the kind of the rising kind of
Mhm.
action and it's a very kind of, it has like a patriotic kind of aspect in the choice of instruments. It feels very empowering.
So in terms of cons, I mean, I have some cons. I say the happy tone and the very dated VFX. What do you think about those?
I understand the VFX a little bit more. I do have take issues with the tone. I think there's kind of like we were watching, and for me there was a huge whiplash of
Mm-hmm.
having this more kind of grounded personal story with Clark and seeing him on the farm, and then seeing him in Metropolis, and everything's been very kind of consistent. Even though the
Mm-hmm.
intro was a little bit different, you could kind of tell it was building towards that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then suddenly we get, the scene of Otisburg kind of going through and fetching the newspaper, and suddenly becomes extremely campy, which was just like random scenes of like huge darkness, like the agent or the cop being pushed onto the train tracks, and I was like, oh my god, like that took me out for how violent it was. They just like killed this guy like randomly, despite us seeing despite them framing like Lex in a very, oh, he's kind of like a very classic kind of mustache twirling villain, especially given like everything he surrounds himself with, and then he kind of goes into this underground lair, which I did like. I did like the Lex's lair, but it was just kind of like, it felt so out of place. It felt like the two things were very disconnected, where everything with Superman was very kind of consistent tonally. This felt like a huge, like a U-turn to a completely different movie. Like an older, campy, like spy movie or something, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
the
and
Roger Moore era of Bond.
exactly. And I think that like I adored Gene Hackman's performance. And he kind of is the only thing that saves that, because otherwise, like those scenes are a huge like loss for me.
Yeah, yeah, I agree with those sentiments. Yeah, I really, really like the almost kind of like double-handed nature of Gene Hackman's performance as Lex. From serious to the campy to classic Bond villain, Sean Connery era to Roger Moore era Bond villain and stuff like that. The VFX, I mean, it looked pretty dated, but overall very good. There was a lot of ingenuity that was thought of when they were
Yeah,
working on a lot of that.
I'm trying to think like if
And
there was a precedent for like, I mean, for anything that was like similar.
Star Wars came out the year prior,
Yeah, and I think
and we
Star
had,
Wars looked pretty good.
and also another interesting fact: the cinematographer who worked on this film, I think his name is Jeffrey Unsworth. He also worked on 2001: A Space Odyssey.
Okay, that
So,
makes sense. Yeah,
so a lot of that kind of went into that film, and
yeah. I think
you know,
some scenes that kind of really like stick out to me, it was really like the Phantom Zone kind of mirror scene. That one looked really really bad.
especially in the sequel.
Yeah, but we're talking about a world where this came out in the 70s, and Jurassic Park only came out in the 90s, like in 93, right?
Yeah,
Which is kind of
'93.
what
Yeah,
kind of leveled up the game, and Spielberg was just getting started. So
absolutely.
I can't hold it against him too bad.
Hmm.
So yeah,
Yeah, so let's talk about the success of the film. So the film was made for a $55 million budget, which, if you adjust for inflation, that is $270 million.
it's a lot.
And its box office, it made $300 million and was number one 13 times in a row,
Yeah,
every week. And for what it, if you adjust the box office for inflation, the numbers was 300 million in 78. If you adjust that, it's 1.47 billion.
Jesus.
So
Yeah.
so if you adjust that for
Yeah.
inflation, so it was really a big movie at the time. You have essentially one of the greatest American superheroes brought to the big screen. And this also begs the question, what do you think? Do you think we'll get those numbers now, or do you just think that, do you
Absolutely not.
think Superman's such a bygone character that at this point people don't care anymore?
No, I don't think so. I think we'll get numbers similar to kind of a middling Marvel movie. That's my expectations. Depending on how well it's received, it could go up a lot, but I think at the minimum that's kind of where we're looking. Just going back to the movie for a second, I thought that the back half of the movie, you know, especially starting with that scene where he kind of fully steps into the role and he goes around, he saves the cat, and he's doing that really romantic interview with Lois Lane, kind of intercut in, and he saves her from the helicopter. Just the music, and you can kind of see the he's gaining confidence and the joy, and everything about that scene felt so Superman. It just felt so right. Like I think it's harder. It's very hard to get a scene that is more Superman and that could have been done better than this one. Everything about it for me was like firing on all cylinders, and then we
Yeah, a
kind
lot
of
of the adventures.
exactly, and then you know, and they kind of go through all the classic hits, kind of one after another, and then it immediately kind of transferring into Lex, which I thought was kind of a nice touch, where you know you have this guy who Superman who's kind of gaining his confidence. He's like, yes, I'm doing this. He's getting the girl. He's being a hero. He's being admired by everyone. Everything kind of goes right. To immediately being taken down a peg by Lex, who's kind of figured out his weakness, and then he goes in just wanting to thinking he could just step in and stop him, and then obviously he gets outplayed and outmaneuvered by Lex, who kind of takes advantage of his overconfidence. Leading into the final act, which I think stretched a while. I don't think that we needed to have like the rewind. I think you could just cut that out and just have him save everyone with difficulty.
I understand the thematicness of it, but I just also I don't know, it kind of got into, and listen, I am not the biggest Superman fan. Of course, as you know, I'm more into like Batman and that character and stuff like that, but like, I just don't like overpowered heroes who can do anything.
Yeah.
And him doing that just shows that he can do anything and nothing can hurt him. And that kind of, at least for me, this film kind of really became it started to become a case as to why Superman isn't really liked within pop culture nowadays, or at least he's not as favored as he used to be.
Yeah, he's definitely lost prominence. I think so. I'm gonna get philosophical for a second, right? I think that before the time travel stuff, it's still very possible to have stakes around Superman, right? Because at the end of the day, he's one guy, right? He can't be everywhere at once. He can't do everything. Even someone as great as he is not gonna be perfect, right? And I thought the movie had been doing a good job up until then, right? Even to the fact where like he wants to go save Lois, but he has to stop a bunch of times because he needs to save Jimmy, and there's a bunch of other things going on. To the point where he arrives late. You know, I was like, oh, that's really powerful. But then kind of having him like, oh, I can just reverse time like anytime I want by just going back around the Earth, and I think he does it twice. You know, and I'm like, okay, well now there's literally zero stakes anymore, right? It's very hard for me to worry about any consequences whatsoever because you've done that. And obviously the second one, they kind of find a solution to that I did not like. But yeah, I definitely think that the time travel section is where it got too far, which is I guess connected to his Silver Age or Golden Age kind of version where he was doing stuff like this in the comics all the time. But I definitely think that it clashed with the more grounded take they were trying to do.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. So let's move on to the second film, The Donner Cut. So we're just going to start off with a little preface. So after the film's success, because the film was planned to be shot back to back, so essentially Superman 1 and 2 are kind of like the same movie in a sense. So the cast and crew returned to work on the second film, but due to creative and budget concerns and disputes between Richard Donner and the Salkinds. Donner decided to leave the project, and Richard Lester was brought in as a replacement. Just so you know, Richard Donner basically, from what I understand, he basically fostered like a very friendly environment on the work set, basically energized the cast and crew and all of that. Behind the scenes, he was dealing with a lot of pressure from the producers because, They wanted him to cut corners, all of that stuff, and because of that, he just couldn't do it anymore. And Richard Lester came in, brought in a whole different vibe to the movie, and made it, from what I understand, a more comedic film. And the reason why we're doing the Donner cut rather than the theatrical cut is because, from what I understand, it kind of fits in a bit better with Superman Returns, which, I don't know, for me, the way I wanted to do this, I wanted to have like a very smooth transition because, technically Superman Returns is a part of the Donner films and ignores Superman 3 and 4. So that's why I decided to do this. Given what I've said, Ichin, what do you think of that?
Yeah, I think, honestly, a lot of the, like, in the second movie, I think a lot of what suffers is Clark himself, right? It's his characterization and kind of the character that we're kind of built to. I really don't like where they kind of took him. And there's some parts I like. I think a lot of this stuff, especially in the Donner cut, you can see what he was trying to do with Zod and the Kryptonians and with Lex. I think a lot of it mostly works. But yeah, I definitely think that a lot of the notes that are taken on regarding Clark kind of ruins his character, in my opinion.
I see. Yeah, I do agree. So, and this is true of both cuts of the film, and you could tell that obviously, like, for those who don't know, the Donner cut was made, I believe, in 2006. So Richard Donner was offered to basically restore his cut of Superman 2, and to do this, he had very limited footage. And, originally he was very reluctant because it's kind of like, I don't really care that much. But I think that given the fact that Warner Brothers really wanted to capitalize off the success of Superman Returns, they were like, okay, let's basically rein in the nostalgia and all of that. So
streamline the viewing experience, I guess.
Pretty much. And as I said before, it's within Superman Returns exists within the continuity of these two films. So let's talk about the pros, Chen. So for me, a pro that I found was that it has somewhat of an interesting story. Interestingly enough, something that I actually picked on was this film has a lot in common with the Sam Raimi Spider-Man trilogy. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
So, Superman who wants to live his life as a normal person, wants to give up his powers. What happens in Spider-Man 2? Peter Parker loses his powers, lives his life normally. So you could obviously tell where Sam Raimi got a lot of his ideas from. But I would say it tells somewhat of an interesting story, but at the same time, it kind of makes Superman almost into an asshole, pretty much.
Yeah, I think it works a lot better with Spider-Man than it does with Superman. I think the story is much more appropriate for Spider-Man as well, right? And I think it's funny because we look at arguably the three biggest characters of comic books, and we had Wolverine in there for the longest time. Those were the kind of the three pillars. And for Batman, his relationship with kind of the costume is that it's something that is unhealthy for him, right? And it's bad for him, but he can't let it go. And for Spider-Man, it's something that he feels that he needs to do, even though he not doesn't want to, right? It's a responsibility that is given, even though it constantly kind of messes with his personal life. And so he's always actively trying to walk away from it because being Spider-Man is miserable, as a Marvel editorial has sought to remind us time and time and time and time and time and time and time again. But I think that for Superman, I think it kind of goes against his theme, right? Which, he's supposed to be the best of us. He's supposed to be someone who's unfailingly good, right? And yes, he might be put into impossible situations and he's incredibly powerful, but he's always going to make the best choice that he can with, given his morals, right? And he's always going to make the best decision that he possibly can. And yeah, I felt like it kind of lessened the character, or at least made it meaningfully different from the version I was used to, right? And I'm talking about the animated version and eventually the comic book version. Yeah, it just felt out of place. It felt, and a lot of the story arc, it feels almost like petty because honestly, they didn't really dive into the hard parts about being Superman, and a lot of stories do that, right? Like All-Star Superman and whatever, they'll deal about, you're hearing all of this misery all the time, and you feel helpless, you can't be everywhere at once, and you're always on, and it doesn't really touch that. He just, I want to be with Lois, but my ghost dad said I can't, and then my ghost dad's like, well, if you're gonna be with Lois, you gotta stop being a superhero. And he's like, okay, I guess I'll stop being a superhero. And then the second that he realizes that he's a weak person now, he's like, shit, I should have kept being a superhero so I could beat up this guy at the bar who was being rude. I felt like it took so much away from how I interpreted Clark and how I pictured him. Because you would think that given the two options, he was going to sacrifice Lois, especially given all of the work that he did to kind of gaslight and gatekeep and girl boss to stop her from figuring out his identity, even though she did multiple times. Which I did think was kind of where she keeps figuring it out and he has to find excuses. But yeah, I don't know. It just kind of felt like annoying, to be honest. I didn't like that story arc at all, and it kind of just felt like an excuse for him to need to kind of overcome Zod in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
But then he ends up getting his powers back, and he still needs to kind of overcome them in a different way. Anyways, so yeah, it kind of felt pointless. It kind of felt like it really took away from the tone and from the character. I really didn't like it. The only thing that I liked about it was kind of his relationship with Lois and how it evolves, and kind of the framing of her issue with Clark was never that he's a loser. It was that he is always putting himself down, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, so I was very mixed on that. Honestly, it really took away from the second part for me, which I thought otherwise was pretty strong. I really liked the Zod and Ursa and Norm parts. I thought they were kind of a fun twist on it. And yes, they're limited by the special effects, right?
Though I do like the effect of the Zod walking on water. I felt that was kind of neat.
Yeah, it was neat. Yeah, they couldn't go that far with you can't have him snapping necks and burning skulls. But you still kind of they still got to show off their powers, and I thought for the most part they had really fun scenes, and so I was kind of bummed that I was like, I just don't care about Superman anymore.
Yeah, pretty much. They kind of made Superman into somewhat unlikable character, I guess. But then again, you do have to create circumstances for your protagonist where you challenge them. You got to create a sense of challenge. But I do felt that it could have been done in a very different or better way. I enjoyed the fact that it maintains the same grounded nature as the first film. I really enjoyed the whole bit with General Zod arriving on Earth and him basically on Mars, and his one of his soldiers has both the American and Soviet flag on his side, which that's quite the statement. Then you have, I don't know why, but it also reminds me a lot of the comics where in Death of Superman, basically Doomsday is just roaming through America, just destroying everything in his path, and I felt that the writers of Death of Superman kind of took some inspiration from that.
Yeah, they felt scary. The three Kryptonians.
Yeah.
And I think almost less so Zod because he's kind of the more disciplined of the three. But the other two, I was like, oh, they will kill anyone at any time. Especially when that scene on Mars on the moon is really effective, which kind of rips out the guy's suit and he just chokes to death, and then the other guy kind of Norn, I think his name, smashes the spaceship or the shuttle. I was like, landing craft, whatever. Yeah, I was like, oh, these guys are actually really scary.
Of course, Gene Hackman steals the show as Lex. Then again, you also have a bit of the campiness of Lex with, Otisburg and East.
Oh, yeah.
And Eve Tessmacher, the whole air balloon bit, where they make this whole, I don't know, almost like this comedy thing where they have so much weight that they can't bring Otisburg with them, and they leave Otisburg in prison.
That was very silly.
That was foul. That was very silly.
And I thought that the rest of the prison scene was surprisingly good,
Yeah.
Despite my hatred and loathing for Otisburg.
Mm-hmm.
Not as a person, but his character and what he represented.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Then, of course, you also show the very cunning and manipulative nature of Lex with Gene Hackman's performance. That's true with most Lex Luthors, I think.
Yeah, I thought he really played off well off of the very serious Zod. Kind of seeing him walking in, thinking he's king shit. Sorry, I don't know if I should swear.
No, you can swear. You can swear.
So yeah, he kind of walks in thinking he's the man, and he's like, oh, we have so much in common, and they don't take him seriously at all. But it's kind of him
pretty much
reading that situation and still kind of turning it to his advantage, and it happens multiple times. Where despite him just being a second away from dying, he's still gleefully reveling in his evilness, and he always has a backup kind of thing. Even though it's just him and all he has are words, I was like, it felt really great. I thought it was a really great take on the.
Yeah, great take on Lex, and of course, kind of leveled the bar that was set for the following Lex Luthors to kind of follow up. And this actually makes me very excited to see what Nicholas Hoult does.
Me too.
Nicholas Hoult worked on a film with Clint Eastwood called Juror Number 5, I think, and Clint Eastwood worked with Gene Hackman in the classic Western film Unforgiven, and Nicholas Hoult asked Clint Eastwood, about how was it like working with Gene Hackman and stuff like that. So I'm very excited. I'm wondering what will James Gunn take from this version of Lex and bring to the new Superman film. So it'll be very interesting.
I will say I've never not liked Nicholas Hoult in anything. I think he's always been stellar. I don't really, I didn't really see him as a Lex type character, but when especially seeing the most recent trailers, he does look to kind of have that devious energy that I think works really well.
Well,
so
the thing about
around on it,
but the thing about that is you've never seen Smallville, right? So the version of Lex that we're getting is very much inspired by Michael Rosenbaum, who played Lex Luthor in Smallville. For those who don't know, Michael Rosenbaum played Lex, and of course he played the Flash in the Justice League cartoon, so he's been around for a while. And I think that's basically the vibe of Lex that we're getting. So in Smallville, it wasn't Lex Corp, it was Luthor Corp, similar to what we're getting in the film. So I think that's basically a lot of what we're getting, or at least the vibe of what we're getting. In Smallville, Lex and Clark are friends, so they're closer in age. So I think what they're trying to do is kind of have two opposing philosophies closer to the same age, battling it out. And you also think about it from the perspective that, like, we're getting a new DCU, so pretty much we need to get young actors to play these characters pretty much. So I think that's the idea. Yeah, so let's talk about the. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say I think that Lex is gonna work well. I will say though, I've never really had a problem with. It's very rare for me to have a problem with any Lex. I even liked Jesse Eisenberg's Lex just fine. It wasn't my favorite, but I didn't dislike it. Yeah. But anyways, I love pretty much every version of Lex. I think I'm not gonna say my bar is very low, but as long as it's what really matters to me is how they interact with Superman and what their dynamic with him is, right? And so as long as Holt kind of pulls that off, I think it'll be fine.
All right. So let's talk about the cons now. The camp, it feels like the film is very incomplete. The VFX, as similar as the first film, is pretty dated. And I just don't like what they've done with Lois Lane in that film where, I don't know, like Lois Lane is so desperate to prove that Clark Kent is Superman that she's willing to jump outside of a building, outside of a window.
I didn't like that scene, even if I did like the fact
like
that
that.
She jumped. Yeah. Yeah, I'm with you there. I think a lot of it is kind of weird. I mean, for me, the greatest thing is always going to be Superman and Clark's characterization, right? I think they really butchered his character in it. But there's a lot of things for me that kind of seem like they're definitely missing. Like, he doesn't really have a relationship with Zod or anything. They never get a 1-versus-1. He kind of has that scene versus all of them where he kind of, gets his shit kicked in. And then that scene where he tricks them. But a lot of those are kind of built more on his relationship with Lex, right? Or his relationship with Lois. They kind of feel like the two stories almost feel completely separate until the very end where suddenly it's over. Yeah. And I think the tone was also kind of all over the place. And I realized that Donner was working with limited material, right? I think that some scenes like the White House scene, a lot of the scenes with the villains feel very dark and grounded, more akin to like the first scene, the first movie. And then, but all the scenes with Lois and Clark feel very campy, feel very out of place. Especially when they like cut out Jimmy, who is, he's supposed to be the comic relief character. He's not there. And instead we kind of have this Clark who's just very whiny and preachy at the same time, which is not something you really want. Lois's character, it kind of just all over the place. Yeah, it kind of just felt like a mess.
Yeah, it felt like a bit of a mess. That's why in some circles people say that the theatrical cut is better. Do you think this is like a Snyder Cut situation, what I've described to you?
It's hard to tell. I think because there's so... Like, I haven't seen the theatrical cut, and I know that Donner was working on limited material, so it's hard. Obviously, this is probably closer to his vision, but it's hard for me to say how much of it was really close to his original vision. Whereas I felt like the Snyder Cut was more complete, right? Because he had all the scene shot, they just kind of put him back in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And not only that, but you also had an outcry of fans that were cheering for the Snyder Cut, whereas with the Donner Cut, it's more... they basically allowed Donner to be like, do what you want to do.
Yeah. I do think it's an interesting parallel that it happened twice with Superman.
Yeah. So I'd say that another con is that they show Superman as very careless. So what do you think?
Yeah, I think so. I think all the whole
Like,
losing his power scene was kind of dumb.
yeah.
Yeah, and just overall, he seems kind of, yeah. I think careless is a good word for it.
Yeah, careless. And, interestingly enough, this kind of also leads to what we're going to get with Henry Cavill's Superman, where, as much crap as we kind of give Cavill and Zack Snyder, I do think that Donner and Reeve kind of laid the seed for what we were going to get with Cavill, with, a very jaded Superman, a very introspective Superman, a very questioning his place within the world Superman. And, another thing that they did at the end where Superman at the bar or restaurant, and he picks a fight with
Oh
the
yeah, he
same guy
goes
that
back.
harassed him. He goes
Yeah.
back to get his get back, and which to me kind of felt very un-Superman to me. And for me, it kind of was like, as much crap as we give Cavill, can we give the same amount of crap to Reeve?
Yeah, I think for me it's hard because I think a lot of the Cavill's performance, a lot of the issue with Cavill's, and I think Reeves aren't necessarily their performances. I feel like Reeves, when he really is doing the switch, when he's playing like Clark and when he's playing Superman, he has kind of a joy and a confidence when he plays Superman that is very that translates to the character very well.
Mm-hmm.
Versus the insecure but still kind of mischievous idea of Clark, where he's trying to almost get people by being hypocrites.
Yeah.
Versus, I think with Cavill, I feel like we didn't get to see him really be Superman, right? He just he did cool things and he had cool scenes, but he was almost silent. Like he never really talked. We never really got to see his Clark.
Yeah.
He gets a few scenes in Batman v Superman that I thought were fine, right? But yeah, I just felt like even now I still feel like I didn't really see anything of his character, right? Versus where I felt like I really got the whole package with Reeves.
Yeah, pretty much. Superman kills in this film. He kills all the Kryptonians. So, what do you think of that?
I mean, he just pushed them down a hole. We don't know that they're dead.
We don't know if they're alive.
They're definitely dead. Yeah. I think it's fairly within the time. I mean, Tim Burton's Batman also killed. I think it really became more of an ideological thing and became more into prominence later when they started having these edgier kind of heroes pop up, right? And they were like kind of sure, and there was kind of this 80s pushback where that's where they wanted to really define the evidence. Define the difference between the two types of characters. I don't think it was that bad in this movie, right? Like, I don't think anybody can say that any of them could be redeemed. And in the old time, they would have been yeeted into the Phantom Zone, right, in the comics, which really I don't think is much better, especially not knowing that what solitary confinement does to a person. So, yeah, I didn't really have a problem with it.
Yeah. So, I guess that's pretty much all that's I have with cons and whatever. So let's talk about the box office. For the budget for the film, I think they were both shot back to back. Same amount as the first film, 55 million, which if you adjust for inflation, it is about 216.3 million. And it made, for its budget, it made back $209 million in the box office, which if you adjust for today's inflation now is 838 million pretty much. So not bad, but not as good as the first.
No, and it wasn't as good as the first.
Yes, but pretty much for the theatrical cut, they were the thought kinds basically were like, okay, we have a tone that we want to do, so let's basically follow that. And they basically ran the Superman franchise into the ground pretty much. So that's basically how we got those very appalling films and all of that. So, yeah. All right, so let's talk about the legacy of this film, particularly the first film. So this film pretty much changed an entire genre. Basically, kickstarted the entire comic book genre in a sense where, because of this, we have the Tim Burton Batman film, the film that it followed. You have the Dark Knight trilogy. You have the X-Men films. We have the Sam Raimi Spider-Man, and more importantly, we have the MCU. So what are your thoughts on all of this? How this film kind of got the ball rolling when it came to comic book adaptations?
Yeah, I really feel like this kind of was a quintessential comic book movie. In my opinion, they kind of did pretty much everything right. At least the first one, right? From introduction of the character to how they deal with their regular life to kind of that final act, big superhero moment where they need to prove themselves, to that middle act, kind of triumphant scene where we get to see them using their powers and being in their element, to the heroic theme. Honestly, it kind of it wrote the book really on how to do it, and it did it well, right? So yeah, no, I absolutely understand why, and I think it deserves a legacy.
Absolutely. Also, at least for me, I always felt that it was important that Superman's this character get his own movie first, in a sense, because this is the first published comic book character, not the first, but the mainstream, action comics.
Well, for a superhero, right?
Yeah, for a superhero. So it makes sense that he would be the one that kind of set the trailblazing for, the other superheroes to follow and all of that stuff. So, from the pages of the comics, he was the first one, and it's very poetic that he'd be the first one in movie form as well. And of course, this is another thing that it was also very important is Kevin Feige. Now, Kevin Feige has been on record saying how this film basically changed his whole perspective on superhero films. He talked about how he used to work for Richard Donner and his wife, Shula Donner. They basically kind of helped him get his first break in Hollywood. From there, he worked as a production assistant on the first X-Men film. And then from there on, he worked with Avi Arad, who was the former president of Marvel Entertainment, and he worked on the following Marvel films. But his job as a PA on the first X-Men was basically making sure that it remained faithful to the comics. Bryan Singer famously did not allow comics to be brought on set, and he was the one who gave a few comic books on Wolverine to Hugh Jackman. He was also there when they were in the makeup chair when they were kind of getting Hugh Jackman ready for Wolverine, the amount of hair gel they needed to put in his hair so that he'd look as accurate as possible to the character. Since then, he has really taken on the very similitude lesson that Richard Donner had, and because of that, he brought that onto the future films that he worked prior to the MCU. I'm not sure if it's still a mandate now, but he said that whenever they hire a new director for any Marvel movie, their main priority is to watch this film because, this film kind of represents everything that a superhero is supposed to be. And I kind of feel that because of that, this has led to their success in dominating the box office, people loving it, people wondering, okay, what does this mean and all that stuff. So
yeah,
what do you think of that?
Something that's really interesting with the Feige approach, and I think he might have taken it from here, is that the Superman movie takes some liberties with the canon, but I think overwhelmingly they respect the core of who the character is and what the mythology of the character, right? We get to see Kryptonite, we have all the main characters, Lex Luthor and Jimmy and Perry, and we have Jor-El, we have the Clark Kent and Lois, big difference between them. He kind of hits all of the marks of this is what you need to have a Superman movie, and he does it well, right? Donner in this case. So yeah, I think it's a good approach, and it clearly paid off. And I think there's a thematic resonance where the movie feels kind of heroic and mythical and empowering because the character feels that way, right? And you see
Absolutely.
that there's a lot of the MCU movies have tried to kind of have that thematic representation of what the character is. And yeah, I think you could kind of clearly see a lot of the through line between the two.
Yeah, absolutely. The through line of this film is very powerful. So much so I'm happy that this is the film that kind of got it started. And so much so that it kind of makes me think of how DC has fumbled their characters. And I remember an interview, may have been a while back, but Feige was asked, with the success of Marvel is having, what do you think DC needs to do in order to be successful, in order to have the same success as you guys? And I think he said they need to look at the Donner films and what they represent. Do you think by not following the blueprint laid by this film, do you think that it led to the downfall of the former DCU?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's important to understand that DC and Marvel are fundamentally different, and I think that Marvel has always been about people with superpowers
Mm-hmm.
versus DC has always been about superheroes that are also people. But the grander, the larger than lifeness of the character comes first,
Mm-hmm.
and that's something that's kind of been missed. I find,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. So I mean, I think Feige is just about the person you can trust the most because
Mm-hmm.
he's done the most.
Absolutely.
So it'd be very hard for me to disagree with him.
Absolutely. And of course, this is our most important part. How do you think this film, or both of these films, will affect Superman and the DCU? Because James Gunn has said that this film will play a very important part in shaping the tone of the Superman, and of course, possibly even shaping the tone of the DCU. So what do you think?
I think there's kind of, and you mentioned this earlier about how overpowered characters are difficult, and I think that there's a hesitancy to write Superman as flawed in any way.
Mm-hmm.
But this movie doesn't shy away from that. I think especially the first one,
Mm-hmm.
and I think the second one overdoes it, but the first one doesn't shy away from the fact that he's not perfect, right? He has
Mm-hmm.
flaws, but he is trying to do his best. And he is trying to do what he thinks is best for everyone, and I think we're seeing glimpses of that already in the trailers.
Absolutely.
So as long as they can kind of keep that core,
Mm-hmm.
I think they're going to be just fine.
Yeah, and also, not only is James Gunn directing and writing this film, he's also basically the CEO of DC Studios. So he basically has, I guess, final cut, making sure that everything is right. And, this film will play a very important part in shaping the future of DC. How so, we will see. Something very interesting, enough, is that the sin of Superman Returns, which we're going to be covering pretty soon, is that it relies too much on this film, on both films, to be more specific. Do you think that Gunn might repeat the same mistakes as Superman Returns?
I don't think so, and I'll tell you why. I think it's because it's already doing a lot to separate itself, right?
Mm-hmm.
From having a bunch of other heroes to setting him in a universe where he's not the first,
Mm-hmm.
to kind of having, somebody who has like an emotional outburst, from what we can see. I also don't think that this movie is as fresh in people's minds as they think it is. I think the moments that do shine and that do come back, or the moments where he's saving the cat and the helicopter and
Mm-hmm.
a few of those different scenes. I don't think that the silly scenes are going to be remembered that well. I don't think that,
Yeah.
I think a lot of it is not on people's minds. Yeah, so I don't think it's going to run into too much of that criticism. But that's, we'll see. I could be wrong.
We will see. We will see. So let's talk about our ratings for both of these films. So for me, I'd give Superman 1978 a 8 out of 10. And I also give Superman 2, Donner Cut, a 7 out of 10. What do you think?
I'm going to give an 8.5 to the first one.
Okay.
I think, part of it's just preference for pacing and stuff that's from modern movies, but it's really glowing for me. And if it wasn't for a bit of the campiness from the Lex scenes, it probably would be a 9 or a 10 out of 10.
Yeah.
The second one, I think personally, I'm going to give it a 6. Because while there's a lot I liked, I couldn't really get over what they did to his character, especially when they got it so well in the first time.
Yeah. That pretty much covers our review of the old Superman film, Superman 78 and Superman 2, the Donner Cut. So look out in July, or maybe even June. So we're going to be watching Superman Return, then we're going to be reviewing that, and we're going to be watching Superman Man of Steel and reviewing that. Then hopefully we'll get it all done before July 11th. We will also do a review of James Gunn's Superman film and basically see how it compares to what we've been reviewing. So, of course, Etienne, it's always been great reviewing these movies with you, and we will talk soon.
Thank you.
All right, everyone. Then. Bye.